Hey, you're listening to the SayOk Creative Podcast, a podcast where we discuss creativity, process, business, and more with the goal to inspire and equip both young creatives and entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Jayden and it's a privilege to have you listening in on either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. In today's episode, I will be talking with multimedia director Kris Merc, who has worked with musicians such as Billie, Eilish, Tyga, Awkwafina, Clarke Jr., Lauryn Hill, as well as comedian Hannibal Buress, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, Adult Swim, Adidas, and more. Regardless of your creative discipline, I'm sure you'll find a ton of value in this conversation. So wherever you're listening from, get ready to learn, and let's dive into the conversation.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jayden. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for making the time to share with all the young creatives listening in. And for those listening, I'm sure you're familiar with Kris's work, but you've probably never known about the genius behind them. His directing work has had hundreds of millions of views and has been part of pop culture for a decade, working with some pretty big names like Billie Eilish, Tyga featuring Justin Bieber, Awkwafina, Clarke Jr., Lauryn Hill, Bernie Sanders, Adult Swim, Adidas, MTV, YG, and comedian Hannibal Buress. I was chatting with a guy named Trung Bao, who you know, who's going to join us in the coming months on the podcast.
Hell yeah.
And he told me,
I love
he's
Trung.
amazing, eh? And he told me about you. And I'd never heard of you, so I quickly Googled you. And then I saw these works you did, and I'm like, that's that guy. And I knew you'd have so much value to add to young creatives and entrepreneurs, so I knew I had to get you on the podcast. So thank you so much for agreeing to do it. And it's gonna be
thanks, man. I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate that a bunch. I love Trung. He's amazing. He's super, super my style too. I think it's like a new breed of creative that kind of just has a little more of a wild style feel.
Definitely.
Sometimes.
Yeah. So, could you tell us about yourself? Introduce yourself to the people that haven't heard of you before.
Yeah. I'm Kristian Mercado. Sometimes I go by the moniker Kris Merc. So depending on have you found me, or some people find me different ways. A lot of my work kind of takes on a wide range of kind of tonalities. So I'm kind of like a mixed media director. So I kind of just don't. I'm not I like to say I'm basically medium agnostic, where I don't think medium dictates the approach, but more rather story or what the objective is should determines the approach of something. And so I've done a lot of crazy music video work, commercial work. Right now I'm very much kind of developing more story and narrative work. And so my work has kind of a wide range, and I think that kind of goes from these two extremes of just really dramatic storytelling to hyper stylized, kind of almost candy spectacle driven work at times, and I kind of I like that feeling, I kind of take on this approach with a lot of my work that I kind of take to heart, called bricolage, which is kind of the idea of mixing things. And I think we live in a culture that is very much becoming more fluid.
Yeah.
And everything starts to mix, and kind of it's almost like a big stew, or a crazy soup.
Yeah.
You just put stuff in, and what's gonna come out. It's kind of an exciting time, and I like to ride that wave. I kind of like the idea that just try to make the coolest thing or the most important thing at the time, based on what the project is, and so those people who aren't familiar with my work can just Google and take a peek. And I've done crazy stuff that Pocky's video,
That was
for
so
example,
cool.
is pretty wild. There's a wild style video where it's there's no rules. And I kind of enjoy that. I think I have a rebellious spirit at times, so I think that influences my work too, kind of the spirit of having a little bit of an outsider perspective, and being kind of a little bit really stuck in my own way, and true to myself too. So I think a lot of my work kind of champions that, and emerges out of that as well. So
cool. Yeah, thanks so much, man. Really love your work, and it's so cool to get to know you. And I think what you're about to share is just going to add so much value to young creatives. I'm fascinated by like the creative process, and I thought it'd be interesting to spend the first little bit of the podcast breaking down your process. And so I've got four types of videos that you worked on, and I'd love for you to share on them. So the first one is a video which has got 26 million views, and that's a snippet into Billie's mind for Billie Eilish and YouTube Music. So do you want to break down the
Oh
creative
yeah.
process for that, maybe?
Oh yeah, absolutely. First of all, it was really dope to work with Billie Eilish. Like
Yeah,
that
I
was just
bet.
is a great experience, and she is like a creative genius. And I think like the approach was that basically Fader had like they were like kind of working with YouTube on like this spotlight series, which is kind of like an episodic kind of styled show. And if you look at my body of work, very often a lot of my pieces are past the 30-second range. Like I think a lot of people work on stuff and it's kind of like bite size, and
Yeah,
especially increasingly so in like an Instagram driven world, where things kind of tend to become more like quick hits. I Because I'm such an avid, I think of myself primarily as a filmmaker, sort of like my inclination is always to lean into longer form work, which has become kind of like like a positive thing for me, because sometimes the projects I get approached about tend to be longer format. So like a Billie Eilish like documentary that's mixed media, it seemed like, I kind of fit into that world because I had like a strong background in this mixed media kind of thing, but
yeah,
also I have a lot of experience working in longer format pieces. So I know how to kind of let a story breathe or kind of, explore something. And when I was first approached about it, they were really intrigued in like my looseness, where I was just like, I think if I have to describe my process in one way really clearly, it's that nothing is sacred,
yeah.
where I don't like, look at things from like this overly precious things. Like I'm comfortable destroying something if I need to. Like if I worked on something for like, I don't know, a day, and I felt like at the end of the day I was like not happy with it, I'm comfortable destroying it, like
Okay.
and that informs my process, because I think like what happens traditionally, I think when people work on something generally is that this is like something I've seen other directors do too. It's like, and this is like something that people are trained to do a lot, is that everything has to be perfect and everything
Yeah.
has to be precious. And I think what happens sometimes because of that is that creatives are kind of stuck in this mind state where like once you get halfway through something or past halfway, you can't acknowledge that there might be something fundamentally wrong with a shot or fundamentally wrong with something you're working on.
Yeah.
And so you're unwilling to destroy it, and you end up working on the mistake for like the duration of it, and then you have to live with it somehow,
Yeah.
which I've seen people do for a lot of times. And my approach tends to be more loose. So I'm like comfortable looking at something and being like, you know what, that doesn't work. Let's destroy it, even if it was a lot of work. And you can kind of feel that in that piece where like there's so much crazy happening at all times. And I think it also marries kind of like that short form feeling of an Instagram feeling, but
Yeah.
into long form. So like I feel like what happens is that I was trying to kind of bridge those gaps too a little bit. And so generally I was just like the first, like obviously I have to pitch it first, and so I do my decks in like Google Slides,
Okay.
and the reason is because I think it's just easier to get GIFs and like moving images into like a Google slide, where suddenly I think like the minute you see a presentation where it's not static, it changes the
Oh,
audience's
for sure. Yeah.
perspective on it. Like where suddenly you're like pitching and it's like, oh, I already see it moving. And I make these crazy collages and Google Slides that just tell you kind of like what you're almost going to have. And the way I approached the Billie Eilish documentary was kind of like this idea of just like almost like a mixed media um, process documentary, where we were like basically comfortable seeing the seams of the project, like I made it a rule where it's like we can see in between the lines, like let's be comfortable showing like the edit bar, like or the Fane's loading or Fane's half
Yeah.
finished or Fane's fully finished, and kind of jump between all those different states, so that it gives it like this candid feeling that you can kind of see how it's being made as as you're watching it, and there's something exciting about that, I think,
Cool.
Um, yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So let's say once you've done the pitch, what would be your next stage? Like,
I think I have a pretty cool crew of people I generally tap. We're kind of like pirates, all of us. It's like that's how I see myself a lot of times when I get approached by like these huge entities that like somehow discover me or whatever, and you know, I'm like, oh damn, I'm like the pirate. I get to like, sail the seas and figure this out. And for this project in particular, I think I figured out first the shooting style, where I was just like, I want to approach like the talking heads interview in a different way that doesn't feel like just a traditional interview style.
right.
Because I kind of like feel like that's so generally you watch an interview footage, it's kind of like very rigid, and
Yeah.
I was like, "That's not the approach I want. I want this to be comfortable and open, and, like, I want it to feel naturalistic," and I think once I said naturalistic, it brought this feeling where the camera can move anywhere, and then, like, we did it in her room, and it feels like a candid portrait in that way, and I never, like, framed her up. I was just like, "Just be comfortable, be where you wanna be, and we'll kind of work towards you." So there's a lot of it was just, like, finding Billie's energy and, like, what her feeling was, and then, like, I was conducting the
Yeah.
interview, so there's, like, an intimate process in that where you're just kinda having a dialogue with this other creative, similar to this right now,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
you just, like it's just, like, an exchange of ideas or just, like, a conversation about her process, and, during that interview, we talked a lot about, like, synesthesia, which was perfect for this project because like, we were able to bring a lot of that to the table visually. So,
Yeah.
like, it felt very appropriate to kind of, like, take that interview, and then we cut that interview, and we had it as master. And, once we had that master, it was almost like we chop it up and then found, like, piecemeal pieces
Okay.
that we felt like could be really strong as a synesthesia feeling where, like, "Oh, this needs, like, a visual, like, who," and then I just know so many animators that I would just, like, and some of it I animated too, but, like, we would just kinda piecemeal and send it out to different people and be like, "Hey, you wanna work on this? Like, are you into this?" Like,
Wow.
and generally yeah, that's kind of my approach, yeah. So I'll just, like, I'll just study, like, a lot of animators and be like, who's are, like, the animators I kind of with, or who are, like, the most outsider people, or who are the most, like, fringe animators there are. Because I generally like outsiders. Like, I think, like, that's just a theme in my life where I think if someone's doing things too traditionally, I kinda get like sort of I have like a it has an adverse effect for me where I'm like, that's played out. I don't want to do that. Like so I'll try to find kind of more like interesting weirdos or like people who are trying to like break the rules rather than people who follow them.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's sick. Um, Man, so the next one I wanted to break down with you was a music video you did for "Come Together" by Gary Clarke Jr., which has got 14 million views. Great song. Um,
Thanks, man.
what do you want to what do you want to share? Like, how did you get that?
That was
That.
through my reps. So I have like reps, which like, for young creatives, if you guys don't know what like a rep is, it's like someone who can it literally means representative, but it's like somebody who kind of like has hopefully your best interest at heart. I say
Yeah, you'd hope
hopefully
so.
'cause, like it is a weird thing to like suddenly let like this other like entity control certain things about like what work you get in, what work you
Yeah,
don't, which can be complicated, as many people probably already know. Anyway, so my rep has always been cool on the music video side. Shout out to him, Doug Killinger. He was really just he had that project, and that actually was a movie tie-in for the Justice League movie, which I
yeah,
know is a bad movie. So
yeah,
like, but I was like, oh, movie tie-in. That's a step closer to cinema. That
yeah, yeah,
seems like
yeah.
So I was like kind of psyched on it, and I think a lot of it. Sometimes when you have those kind of like music videos where it's like mixed with like a film, you're always like kind of like it always feels weird. Like I always felt like, oh, that's a weird thing. So my approach was like, how do I make it not weird? you know?
Yeah.
And I try to smooth out the transitions a lot. So like the Gary Clarke is an amazing, amazing musician. Like
Oh,
he's
definitely.
fantastic. Like he's an amazing talent, and like having him on set was like incredible. And so I was really just trying to like make him almost like a superhero in that project, where I was like, I'm gonna integrate you into this world best I can, and I'm gonna just try to make like the coolest movie music video there is. That
And I
was kind
think
of
you
my
definitely
approach.
did that. It's like sick.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Yeah, because I basically we focused a lot on like making sure that they felt like seamless, where you don't feel the cuts as much, where you
Yeah.
have like this world where like Clary Clark is kind of like on the moon and like space, and it becomes quite psychedelic in that way too, because then you're starting to like put somebody in space, and it has like this
Yeah.
Afrofuturism vibe too. So I was just like, it was really nice working with Gary generally, because he's fantastic. And then like I think like that energy that he brought to set kind of translated really well into the film. And so me and my editorial partner Rooter, we work together all the time. Something that might be interesting to know about my process is that I generally try to work with the same people if I can.
Okay.
I think that's interesting for young creatives or even older creatives, because like something to think about is when you start working with teams of people, sometimes as a freelancer, you're kind of just the teams are like kind of like constantly changing, right? And something I start to recognize, at least for myself and my body of work, and this is more probably from a directorial standpoint, was that once I started working with the same people, there was more consistency emerging in my work, and then it defines your voice more, because you're able to like kind of partner up with people, and then suddenly it's like everyone kind of has a similar sensibility, so you don't have to
Yeah.
always like over explain yourself every single time you're doing a project.
They just get your
And
vision and
yeah, exactly. You can execute a vision like way clearer. But yeah, that was the process for that one. Yeah.
cool.
It was-
So, like, with a music video,
Yeah.
obviously you've got the artist's opinion of what it should look like, and it's the song's their baby essentially. So, how do you come in and you go, "This is what I'm thinking," and how do you marry
Mhm.
up, their views and your views together and make it
That
into
was
a
a
video?
crazy project, because there was actually a lot of people involved in terms of, because there was Gary Clark, but it was also like Warner Brothers.
Yeah,
So like I was dealing with like a lot of like high level kind of uh stuff. And I think like I created a treatment. I think treatments generally are kind of like the first step. And like I think they were really attracted to that, like because it had like a lot of consideration for like how Gary and the footage would live and be married together. And I kind of like basically just sold them on this idea of just like making Gary Clark like one of the heroes essentially. Like let's have him feel like he's in that world, and like let's treat him in a similar sensibility to that. And I think that excited them, and it felt like a non cheesy way of integrating him. And I'm into psychedelics personally, so like having like this world where it's like kind of like on the moon and there's space imagery just like really really was attractive. And I
cool.
think that attracted them as well, where they were like, this is a cool weird vision. And I was like, yeah, let's ride it out.
And yeah, it's sick. Now next one is tour visuals you've just done for Lauryn Hill on her latest tour. Tell
Oh
us about
yeah.
that.
Oh, that was dope, man. That is like an extension of my constant love of Afrofuturism for sure. Where like I really, 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 really respect Lauryn Hill. Like I
It's
have to like
incredible.
there's so many like reallys I gotta throw in there. I think of her as like, I don't know, her voice is so special and enduring in our culture that
Yeah,
she's remarkable. So like anytime I've worked with her, I'm always like very like precious about it. So like those tour visuals were like basically her remixing a lot of her older visuals and like things that she's attracted to or things that speak to her. And so she kind of gave me like a body of work of all that stuff. And then we were tasked with remixing it. So I definitely took on this like more like Basquiat kind of feeling.
Okay.
That was a big influence there. Basquiat in general is a big influence for me. Like I just love his approach to life and his approach to art and just his story in general. And I was able to kind of like basically I just ran with that project. I put a lot of heart into it and I think it shows. It has like a warmth to it. And yeah, just I was definitely like that style and that vibe is just really coming out of like being true to like Afrofuturism and being true to like this aesthetic that Basquiat created like years ago, you know. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Now, Basquiat's got some cool work. Definitely.
yeah,
Like, what was
totally.
he? 60s, 70s?
Yeah, 70s, 80s, even maybe, right? Like Basquiat. I'm gonna
Yeah.
Google that. Yeah,
Oh, and he's Puerto Rican too, which should
yeah,
be
100%.
yeah,
Yeah, he's half Puerto Rican. Yeah. That's definitely a big
cool.
reason where I was just like, "Oh, yeah, that's like it's cool to reference, your own sometimes and be like,
Yeah,
we'll pull from that," you know?
cool. So the next one is a promo series for a presidential campaign for Democrat Bernie Sanders in 2016.
Yeah, oh, man, that was cool. So that's a purely, live action project, but I gave it a black and white aesthetic, right? Is that correct? It's been a while, sorry. Yeah, black and white. So we gave it like a aesthetic where it was black and white and photographic, and I think that was like the objective. It was we were dealing with some serious stuff, so like I think that obviously that election was crazy that year, and
Definitely.
I was a pretty proactive person trying to get like basically I worked on Bernie Sanders like visuals. Like I worked on like I want to say like 2 to 4 different spots maybe.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, one of them was with Spike Lee, which was like incredible because I got to watch Spike Lee direct, and that was like a very like life defining moment, and like kind of like really taught me a lot. And it was just cool to watch him. I was kind of like basically B Unit directing like a separate set of promos, parallel to like the main promo that he was doing that was going to be used for online. And then the other promo that I worked on for Bernie Sanders, which is the one with the black and white aesthetic, um, that kind of came from that as well. Because then another organization was working on Bernie Sanders promos, and so we ended up kind of just building out those promos for him. And it was really coming from just my own passion, really. Like I was just like really into Bernie Sanders, so I was just like very open to that. And so when I was being approached for those spots, I just kind of said yes and went with it. And I didn't even look at the money. Like I was like, no, it's cool. Don't even worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was kind of like that type of project. But those are basically just really clean interviews. Like they were just like the approach actually was kind of just more about being immaculate on frame and then like really just asking the right questions, you know? Sometimes that's all it takes, you know?
Yeah. No, that's a cool thought too, because like you've got the two extremes, so your work kind of fits the audience, and I think lots
Oh,
of young creatives can get um, they get hooked on one idea and then they put it into everything, but without taking into consideration the audience. Like,
oh
Billie
yeah,
Eilish, she's super into her comfort and being who she is, like she
totally.
said it about the way she dresses. So her being comfortable sitting on her bed in her bedroom,
Yeah,
the way you interviewed her. Gary Clark Jr., obviously quite a prominent guy, so having quite a strong sort of visual for him. Lauryn Hill just being super chill, part of pop culture. Um, Ever since her breakout thing back in Sister Act 2.
yep,
And then you've got Bernie Sanders with his, his, I suppose, family values, calm, crisp.
yeah,
Um,
totally. He
s-
just I think Bernie Sanders though, like just appeals to like a new generation of people in general, similar to like
yeah,
a lot of politicians that seem to be emerging who are kind of like trying to like I think they're just trying to like right some wrongs. I'm guessing like anyone
Yeah.
who gets into politics, not everyone. I'm sure there's some people that don't, but some people probably come, especially like emerging from this like new, I guess, world that we're kind of starting to see emerge. They're trying to like
Yeah.
right some wrongs, and I think I find that appealing. Like, yeah, I think I don't know. I like new waves. Like I think generally I try to like always be on the cusp of something interesting, and some of my work I
Yeah.
think has that tonality for sure.
Cool. Would you consider yourself a storyteller or someone who likes making sick videos?
I definitely consider myself a storyteller, mostly, and it's something that I think it's really important to point out that you mentioned it earlier, but the audience, and I think a lot about audience, and I think like the truest way to look at all this stuff that we do is that you are having like a conversation with an audience, ideally,
Yeah.
like that's kind of like what this is, you're creating something and then presenting it, and then someone consumes it or like watches it or digests it. And I think for me, my biggest passion is storytelling. Like I think the reason I do what I do is because I love stories and I love watching film, and you know, I like short form stories and I like music videos that tell stories, and but I think I too am like into aesthetic, and like sometimes I can kind of venture into like veins that have like a crazy like spectacle aspect to it, and that's kind of like where
Yeah.
I kind of jump between the two. I think sometimes um depending on like what the task is, I can kind of fluctuate between those two extremes, where I can kind of go like for pure narrative, or I can go to pure spectacle. But I try not to do pure spectacle just for the sake of it, if I can avoid it. And
Okay.
sometimes I kind of land in the middle, which is great, which is like a Billie Eilish piece can kind of be like
Yeah.
narrative and a spectacle at the same time. And that's kind of like where that kind of exists. And then other fans could just be like crazy eye candy or wild. And I try to put an intent behind it even when I do that, but sometimes depending on the task, I don't know, you're not allowed.
Yeah.
Depends.
I love how I love how you mentioned intent too. I'm actually working on a podcast at the moment, called about intentionality and creativity.
Mhm,
And I think that's such a key part of the creative process, I suppose.
totally,
If you're not creating with a purpose, it's just, making and doing. And
totally.
I think that's really important when you're, working with big clients, that you're actually sure you're being creative and doing something new, but if it's intentional, then it makes a
Oh,
difference.
yeah.
Uh,
We 100% yes, generally wanna have, like, an intention, and I think that intention changes the tone of a piece. People suddenly put
yeah.
more value to it, and it changes everything. So, I think, like, when I lean on aesthetic, sometimes I'll try to make the aesthetic about something cultural, like, the Lauryn Hill piece to me kinda leans heavily on, like, aesthetic, but then, like, all those aesthetics have, like, a history and a meaning behind it, so I'm not just doing it
Yeah.
for, like, the sake of doing it, I'm doing it because it propels some sort of larger narrative forward that you're, like, tapping into. The reason I think actually storytelling is really powerful and really helpful is that, since so many stories kind of resonate within like the dialogue of our culture in this larger sense and bigger way, is that when you do find those stories and you're able to tap into them, you become part of a larger dialogue, and you're able to like tap in and tap out of it, and you can kind of change the story or reference it or pay homage to it, and then suddenly all those really powerful like inferred um motifs or values or um anything that's associated to that story can kind of be associated to what you're working in too. Um, so
Yeah.
that's like a powerful thing.
Cool. Um, yeah, so that's a really important thought, I suppose, if we're making sure to do it with that intentionality and taking it back to cultures or whatever you're trying to portray. Yeah, so the next question, kind of on the back of that, I
Hmm.
suppose. So you've taken these ideas and all that, and you've made something which you think works and makes sense, and you've done the pitch, and the people love it.
Yeah.
And then you make something, and you actually get criticism from the clients. And I think as creatives, we kind of get our heart attached to a project,
Totally.
even though sometimes we shouldn't. But I suppose when we work on it for such a long time, we can get attached to it. So how do you deal with someone saying it's just not what they want, or it looks
hmm
rubbish, all that stuff?
I think like I would recommend pick your battles is like what I think. Like you have to kind of be
Great.
very realistic, like case to case what you're working on. I think where I think if a project is like a passion project and you recognize that it's really a passion project and you see it being like something important in a larger context or like you think it's worth the fight, then I say you can definitely you can make it a stand and try to like push back against certain things, but only if you really, really think it's worth it. I think otherwise, like I would never recommend any creative to work on like say, I don't know, a toothpaste commercial or something and then make a stand on that. Like
Yeah.
don't make a stand on toothpaste commercial. That's like clearly a task and like a project and don't necessarily like you just know what you're kind of being realistic or having like a third person perspective on like what you're working on so that when it's worth kind of giving a little pushback versus not, And so like I think like on some cases, like if I've worked on say something ultimately, I guess when you have a client, they're kind of like the ultimate deciders, like they decide. They
Yeah.
kind of are like commissioning it. So they have to have a say. And I think like I've always had a difficulty, I think, with like the creative industry because I think like a lot of times there's a it's treated like a service industry when it should be treated more like a highly specialized industry. Like you would never tell a lawyer like, oh, how to practice the law. You would never tell like a
Yeah.
doctor like how to operate on you. So like I think it's very really
That's such a good way of putting it.
yeah, it's really silly how like in the creative industry, like, people come to you with like creative problems and then they're telling you how to diagnose it. And it's actually like that is not a good approach. It's fundamentally flawed,
Yeah.
actually. So I think it depends on the client, but the clients, good clients will trust you, and then that's kind of like I think like that's important, I guess, to your audience, where like I guess the more you are true to your own voice or your own style or your own like intent or whatever you're like trying to accomplish, then what ends up happening, it's scary, but you filter people out in some ways because then suddenly the clients who think maybe you're difficult or the clients that don't want to like with that style, they'll kind of pretty much not work with you. But then the people that really, really like what you're doing will probably double down on what you're doing, And so
Yeah.
you start to build a body of work because what can happen is like if you're trying to be too agreeable all the time, you end up becoming mediocre, And that's a danger
Mm.
too. So you have to be like very like conscious of like what you're trying to do, So like you definitely want to work, but you definitely don't want to compromise all the time where suddenly the body of work you're building has no personality or has no intention, and then suddenly you're just like a cog, and that's cool too. I mean, not saying like I don't know, that's a complicated thing to say, right? Like it is true, but it's real. It's
Yeah.
very real. So you got to be careful in how you approach things, So like my recommendation is like to be very true to what you want to do, you know what I mean? Like be very like honest about what you're trying to do and then like approach your client situation that way, where at some points maybe you're also sometimes clients hit you up but really you're the one interviewing them, because maybe you want to know,
Yeah.
are they a good fit for you, and that's a good approach too, so that's crazy to say, but I think that can sometimes create a stronger body of work than just necessarily doing everything they'll sell you, you know what I mean?
Yeah, for
They
sure.
might want also, like, in some cases, it's good too because I think they might want an opinion as well. So, like, hopefully you have a good client, they're just, like, open to that, But I don't know, it's a relationship, Like anything in life, that stuff is like a relationship, right? So, like, sometimes having that pushback is helpful too. Like you don't sometimes having a client who's vocal and knows what they want, that's fucking perfect. And then it gives you the
Mm.
ability to define a piece. And so when they tell you something's rubbish and maybe it really spurs that in you where you're like, yeah, you know what? They're right. Like this client's super smart. I think it depends on the level too. Like if you respect a client a lot, then you want their feedback and that feedback is valuable. And that's a different type of client too. So like I think it's finding those right partners. You're
Mm.
entering a partnership each time, so you want it to be, you have to evaluate all those things, I think. Oh man, that was intense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's kind of like, if, for example, if Nike said it looked rubbish, then you'd kind of take it on board. They've got a good
Yeah,
reputation. But if you've got
absolutely. Yeah,
a Mara Pass store saying that's not what we want, then you've got to take it with a grain of salt and go,
yeah,
hey, maybe it's not what you
totally.
thought. Yeah, and I think also, um, yeah, just with the whole creative process, it's one of those things you've got to get into a partnership with the right people. I suppose it's like, you don't keep going to a doctor who,
Yeah,
just doesn't
you're gonna
agree
be
with your
you're
say,
constantly sick or
you know,
something, or they're not diagnosed
yeah,
this week. You're
exactly.
right, and then why would you go to that
Yeah,
doctor all the time? And so it's like,
yeah, it's like,
like you said, yeah, it depends on who you're like. If you are like working with somebody like Nike, it's like, oh, they have like a proven like magnificent body of work and they've done incredible campaigns and you can kind of maybe trust that opinion a little bit more. Like Nike knows who they are, you know what I'm saying? So like I think if you're a smart creative, you acknowledge that too and you're like, you know what? Like yeah, let's see what you guys are really looking for, but you're also like being mindful of their history as well. So like there's a history that they're carrying with them. So I think like that's the thing too. Like with brands, a lot of times with brands, it's more like what a brand is just a feeling. Like brands can just be like an emotion that you attach to
yeah,
it.
I
And
agree.
and I think if you're toned into that emotion, then you're pretty much gonna do what they need, I think. But you might be out of sync yourself, and that's important to acknowledge too. So you have to kind of know what you're kind of dealing with. Like if you're working with Google, you kind of know what their brand is. Like what their like feeling is. So you want to align to that, or like you or acknowledge where you align into the perspective of that. Like I've worked with Facebook
Oh,
before,
wow.
and yeah, and it was cool. And they have like a lot of I feel like they're very like astute as to like who they are. So like there's not like a lot left. There's not a lot of guesswork, because you can kind of understand what they're like kind of looking for, when
Yeah,
you do work with them. And I think that a good brand generally knows who they are. So like you're able to kind of figure it out with them.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's real
Yeah.
cool.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I hope you're finding value in this conversation today. Our goal is to share and learn from industry-leading creatives to help you as a young creative entrepreneur thrive and develop. So if you haven't already and are listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or YouTube, hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with all future content. If you're finding value in this podcast, leave a comment or review. It helps us to reach so many more young creatives. And why not share this podcast with your friends, because I'm sure they will learn a thing or two regardless of their creative passion. Anyway, let's get on back to the episode.
Cool.
And I think kind of what you're saying too, like understanding who they are. So when let's say you start a project, right, and you're about to make your pitch deck, where do you get your inspiration from? So you mentioned Biscuit, um, and all these other people. So obviously, like Lauryn Hill, you've got
Yeah.
the cultural side with what who she's done traditionally. So you've taken her old
Yeah.
work and remixed it. But
Totally.
how do you find inspiration for projects like that? Oh, I'm trying to think of the name of it right now. The Pocky's video,
Oh yeah. Pocky.
Awkwafina. Obviously, it's
Uh-huh.
like super heaps of retro elements in it, but with like modernistic, kind of like Stranger Things, neon.
Ah, yeah.
Um, so, how do you find
I love
inspiration?
that. Yeah, wow, that's a crazy question. It's funny because like I know that like everyone kind of gets their references from somewhere, right? And like
Yeah,
I kinda try it's hard to do this, but I try to, like, um okay, so nowadays, it's crazy because we have, like, Instagram, right? And so, like,
Yeah,
if you if you with Instagram heavy, what's really powerful and it's sometimes scary too. I'm like the type of person that's always a little cautious about things. Um, is that they have like these powerful algorithms that basically like tune in to what you like
yeah,
essentially. So like the more you engage with something like that, the more it's feeding you. So I try to like that sounds pretty dark at some point, right? But like I try to work it so that it does work for me instead. So like when I use Instagram or when I engage with it, I'm not ever engaging on it on a level that to me is nonsense. Like I'm always just like only liking what I like, only
yeah,
looking at what I like. You know what I mean? So that the algorithm hopefully works for me. And so what ends up happening is that I get fed a lot of like stuff that generally is cool, like based on my own taste, you know? And so I do get a lot of inspiration from just watching Instagram, which is crazy to say, but it's just that that algorithm is fresh. Like
yeah,
I try to keep my algorithms clean. Like I'm always like, nah, I don't want any like whack shit on my algorithm.
yeah,
so,
yeah,
so like I'm just always trying to reinforce that. And I like obscure things as well. Like I think I'm like a sucker for that, you know? Like I'm not the type of person who like if something has a million followers, I'm like gonna be into it necessarily. I might be, but like what I'll generally look for is like the more low key stuff, like the things that people aren't really paying attention to that I feel has potential because then it kind of separates things. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
you get to tap into something that might not be popular yet, or like you can kind of define it, or you can help like boost it. There's like different things, or it'll stand out visually or stand out creatively. And I'm fascinated by that. So like right now, I'm really, really inspired by like people who like preserve 1980s analog technology that creates motion
yeah,
graphics, for instance. Like to me, that is super fascinating. Like that there's like a small subculture of people right now that are like working to preserve all those machines that are like dying out and they're like maintaining it and they're able to like use it and create graphics that I think very few people can. And
yeah,
suddenly they're like the only ones who have access to that and they're the only ones who can make that stuff, you know. And I think a good analogy to that is like in cinematography, some of the best DPs they own like lenses that they don't fabricate anymore, you know, because
yeah,
they're out of, you know, and a lot of it has to do with some crazy where like you know, because of our manufacturing processes back in the 70s and 80s and all that, you know, we didn't have as many strict laws. So like that some of the chemicals that would make those lensings and coatings are now illegal, you know?
yeah,
So, so those lenses only exist for that short period of time, right? So now they're like the look that is attached to that lensing is unique to that lens. So unless you can find that lens and shoot on that lens, you're not going to get that look. And
yeah,
so I think in the world of visuals and motion graphics and the world of animation, the people preserving these older machines right now are something that really inspires me, you know? Like where they're like kind of like almost like I don't know. They're it's like a vinyl collector, you know? Like I'm like,
yeah. Oh, that's so cool. I love
yeah,
vinyl.
yeah, I'm the same. So I'm like I'm fascinated by that, you know? Like I'm really more inspired by people who have like weird niches and like doing something that's just like odd like that. And that to me is like right now something I'll look at a lot. And like I think
Yeah,
it shows in my work, obviously.
yeah. Oh, that's cool. So it's like, I'm thinking the Duffer Brothers, they got all the inspiration for Stranger Things from all these old 80s movies,
Oh
like,
hell yeah, hell
are
yeah.
you kind of
Oh
the same?
yeah.
Like, do you get inspiration from different movies and different
Oh
direct
yeah. Oh, okay. So I'm always watching film. Film is like a huge, huge passion of mine. It's kind of like where I'm kind of moving towards. It's just kind of like filmmaking in general. A lot of the reason I do longer form pieces and I'm attracted to music videos is because having a longer duration lets you do more things. You can explore more. And I'm just inspired by the 70s movie culture, 90s movie culture as well. Like I think
Yeah.
those two eras specifically have some of the best films like exist, you know, things from like Fight Club, The
Oh,
Matrix,
great movie.
Easy Rider, Dog Day Afternoon. You know, like all these films, I love them just because like they don't really, you know, those are movies that are probably harder to get made now than they were at the time they were
Oh,
made, which is
definitely.
crazy. And they all had something powerful to say. So yeah, I find a lot of inspiration there. I mean, nowadays I'll watch an A24 movie. A24 is like what I kind of with the most at the
Yeah.
moment. I mean, I think there's a lot of other companies doing cool stuff in movies like Neon as well, but like
Yeah.
I feel like anytime I look at the A24 logo, I'm generally gonna see like something that's got an auteur sensibility, and then like it'll be a little different than like say a mainstream film. And yeah, I like the current state of independent cinema is fascinating. So I'm always looking at that stuff too, and I'll definitely pull reference from that. Like I'll kind of watch if a movie it hits me and emotionally does something cool, I'll use that emotion and carry it as a reference point for myself. You know, where even if I'm working on something else, or even if I'm working on an animation, I try to remember how something made me feel and apply that to it. You know.
Cool. Yeah, and we were talking before the interview here, and we were talking about like different types of media, and we were chatting about your views on different types of media. So, could you share on that? Like, what are your views on different types of media?
Oh yeah, I'm like medium agnostic, so I kind of feel like I think it's weird that people kind of categorize fame. I think this is like categorizing things is definitely such a weird thing. Like say like the Oscar categories. Like I always feel like it's weird that the animation Oscar is like separate from like just the best movie Oscar because
Yeah,
like to me, it's not that like animation is not really the genre. I always have to remind people that like animation is not a genre. Animation is just a medium. So like it's just a means to execute a story, you know. So it's like whether you film the story or whether you're drawing it frame by frame or rendering it for like I don't know 20 hours or more, depending on what you're doing. Um, to me, it doesn't really matter. Like, I feel like it's more like what you're doing with it, and people want to categorize it and label it, but that's like a people thing. Like, I don't think that your story or what you're trying to execute or your intention are defined by those things, you know?
mm,
So, like, you just work in the medium that to you best suits the task at hand. So, like, for instance, that Billie Eilish piece, just because I think she is so like connecting this idea of audio visual where like
yeah,
there's like a strong connection with like this feeling of like how she builds her music and how it makes you visually feel and trying to merge that together somehow. The task at hand is I think it's better to show a mixed media piece to tell her story because you're able to kind of create an emotion or a response based on all those visuals and like kind of almost tells you something generationally or something about that story, you know? And
yeah,
that to me is like more important than say being just locked into one medium and being like, you know, like this story should be just this way or being labeled a certain way. I think
mm,
it's cooler to just do what the task at hand requires, you know, and then like not worry about so much about how it's labeled. But it's weird, you know. I think mediums are just tools to be played with, you know. Like you should just do what you need to do or what you love, you know, and that defines it, you know.
yeah. And I think there's like musically too. You get these bands that are in the rock genre for a long time, then they go and do something random, or we've been
Hmm.
thinking of Old Town Road. It's that
Oh
song.
yeah, I
You know,
love that. I love that. Yeah.
but like the whole thing with it, not being country and then it being taken out of the country charts and all that. But that's kind of the type of media. It's still telling the same story.
Yep.
It's country. The lyrically, I suppose it's country, and it's he's
No, 100%. Like I think what you're talking about is exactly how I see myself territorially because I think that Lil Nas X, for example, right? Like what he was doing was he's just making a song, you know what I'm saying? Like he
Yeah.
doesn't really I don't think he was trying to label it. He's just like influenced by country, influenced by hip hop, influenced by trap, and he makes it. And it's like, it's genreless in a way, like it's not
Yeah.
like adhering to any rules. And so society is like trying to label it, like society or like labels or whatever. I don't even know who's doing it, like Billboard, like they're just trying to like, oh, where do we put this? Is this here? Is this here? And
Mm,
that's exciting actually in a way because
yeah.
it's kind of
So
cool.
agree.
Yeah, and I kind of like that. And I think that's happening more in like our field as well, where like the boundaries are being pushed and the boundaries are also getting looser. Where like, because even like say for rendering, right? Like when people render, there's so many different ways to render something now that really it's more about like what you want to do rather than the process that you do it in. So um, yeah, I don't know. I'm more interested in that. Like, I'm interested in like things that don't have to be defined in one category.
Great. Yeah, I think we need to stop adding like the different genres and the classifications to creativity. It's all just different mediums to create the same outcome.
Totally.
Um, yeah, and I think that's such an important thing for young creatives. I suppose we can get quite siloed um, in what we do. For example, if you're just you're doing something, but you're only doing Scandi design, or you're only doing boho or whatever, Bauhaus.
Hmm.
So I think it's one of those things. You just need to kind of have a broad
Yeah,
spectrum of stuff you're doing, and
totally. Yeah. I mean, what's exciting too is like when you know the rules of something and then you break it. Like, I was
yeah,
explaining this to somebody where it's like mastery of something is powerful in the sense that once you know the rules of something, when you break one rule, everyone notices it, and then that becomes the style. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Because like
I mean,
you're trained to understand it one way, but the minute you change it enough where like people notice it being different, then that's like something that triggers people to look.
yeah, and I think it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's maybe it's not the norm until
Yeah.
it becomes the norm. You know?
Yeah, totally, 100%, yeah. Like, I think we could look at Tarantino, it's an easy, like, way to, like, talk about that, but, like, when he kinda came out with Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, that was so radically different at the time when it came out in the '90s where, like, everyone in the film industry and everyone who watched films was just like, "What is that?" You know? And, but then over time, it's become a style where, like, you
Yeah,
can kind of say this movie's very Tarantino-like. And, so that's kinda like how that works, I think, yeah. People kind
yeah, I
of
think
break a rule, and then it becomes kinda like the norm, and then someone else has to break the rules for it to be redefined.
exactly. Yeah, and I think it's funny you said that about how it was, Pulp Fiction was seen as very different. Like, I watched it for the first time maybe 2 years ago, um, and I was like, "This is so cool," but it was kinda like it didn't feel like it was so different to everything I'm used to watching. But
Yeah,
if you're
totally,
everything before that, I love old movies myself too, and like everything before that was so different.
totally.
Same with Spielberg, everything was different, and then his thing was so weird, like E.T.
Oh,
Just
totally.
everything was so different.
Yeah,
Um,
Spielberg was crazy too, because like,
yeah,
he definitely defined, like, what the blockbuster film was, but before him, really, the way he moved the camera I think, like, Spielberg is cool to watch just because especially, like, earlier, just because like, if you watch his movies more, like, from, like, he just where he puts the camera and how it moves, he was moving it and putting it in places that at the time when those movies were out, a lot of other directors weren't really doing that, and so it stood out quite a bit. Like, if you watch his old movie Duel, I don't know, that's a really obscure pull, but Duel was, like, this car chase movie, but he tells you most of the story just with camera placement and movement, like not even like heavy dialogue. And so he was just able to do that way before a lot of other people were even thinking that way. But now that's just common cinematic language.
yeah,
So it's really interesting to think about.
Yeah, for sure. Now I'm going to move on to the next section, which is a few questions from some of our listeners. So a guy named Tony, who's 23 from Denmark, asks that he says, I've been told from other music video directors that you cannot make your living on it. Is this true? And if so, what advice would you give to people who have a passion for creating?
Man, okay, so music videos are definitely so difficult. Like I would say that like I don't disagree with the thought that making a living solely from music videos is really difficult. It's a lot of reasons for that. But I'm not saying I wouldn't discourage people from trying it because I think what you should always do music videos almost like a companion or like a secondary thing to something else. Very few people can make a living just from solely music videos. Like it's
Yeah,
really, yeah, it's super competitive, and also like I would almost say like being a commercial director is easier than being a music video director in some ways, which sounds insane, but it's just sometimes I think like with music videos you'll get like I don't know. There's some music videos that have like 10 directors pitching on it, which is an absurd amount, you know?
yeah,
So they become more like passion pieces, I would say. Like they're just kind of like things that you take on. I don't discourage it though, because I think people should do it anyway. Cause like the way I look at music videos is like theater, where like it's kind of like theater is just kept alive because you know we culturally see a value in it, you know, and so I feel the music video similarly has a kind of feeling where like we keep it alive. But though there's a lot of there's a long dialogue because there's so many things were happening with music videos right now where like they are kind of like in a resurgence right now. So like I don't know if it's fair to say that it was for a, a while it was kind of like a dying art, and now it's resurged in a bigger way. But I don't know if the industry has kind of shifted that way yet. So like
yeah,
it's a complicated thing. But I do think people should do them because like you learn a lot. You learn a lot quicker. You are giving a lot of creative control over a piece. You can kind of
yeah,
imprint your personality into a music video a lot more than say a commercial, you know? Um, so there's a lot of valid things in pursuing it. I think they're just like more if it was just strictly like an economic thing, there are definitely bigger risk and building like like a sustainable career. I mean, even the top music video directors will tell you that like it's all you know they wouldn't be able to sustain themselves just from strictly directing music videos. So I would definitely caution people to have some other type of thing happening while they're doing music videos.
yeah,
Look at them more as like labors of love, and that's what they become. They you don't really want to do a music video for like money. It just doesn't make sense. It's more
yeah,
like you do it because you love it or because you want to or you have something to say or the artist speaks to you, which you know I think a good piece of advice for emerging creators is to only work on a music video if you 100% feel passionate about it, because the only thing you're going to get out of it in a way is the final piece, and it has to be true to you. So like
yeah.
you know that's the benefit. So it has kind of like a there's definitely like a risk reward thing going on with music videos, I would say.
Great. Yeah, I think that's true because you started in commercial and then you've dabbled into music videos, eh? Like,
Right.
what was the first one you did? That was trying to think of the name.
Della Soul.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, Della Soul.
Yes.
That was a
So that
crazy start. That was a crazy way to start.
yeah, it's not exactly the most standard switch from because you're doing like stuff for Adidas
Yeah.
um and so
Yeah.
switching over to music videos. It's
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. So like
yeah, go for it.
I definitely started more in the commercial world. So that was kind of like uh my bread and butter. Like I feel like I was kind of like raised on like the commercial side of things cuz like early on in my career I kind of got into the studio art directing scene pretty big,
Okay.
and I was kind of just working a lot of studio kind of gigs, and at some point I was working at a big studio as a director, actually directing like a lot of commercials, but then like even though I thought my commercials were like cool and I was having a good time doing it, um, I got hit up for this my first music video, which was De La Soul, and I was like, when I saw the budget for it, it was like almost absurd. Where I was like, in my head, I was just like, oh man, is that even possible? Like, how am I gonna make this? Because they were asking us to do like a Rubik's cube with them projected on it, and I was like, man, working all these like crazy jobs that were commercials, I kind of had an understanding and a scope for like how big projects can be and how they can get. But I kind of talked to a friend and I was just like, hey, man, I got hit up by De La Soul to do this music video. I've never done a music video before. And I asked him, should I work on this? Like, it seems like the budget's crazy. And he gave me a piece of advice that I kind of hold on to till this day. He said, just say yes and then figure it out as you go. and,
Yeah.
and that redefined that moment is crazy because, like, after that, I was able to take on so many different projects that I wasn't really taking on before. And it was just a philosophical kind of like tweak that just happened in my brain. I don't know what happens. It's weird when that happens when somebody can just tell you something and it just hits you that way.
Yeah.
Because suddenly it was like solving a puzzle where I was just like, you know what, I'll say yes. And then suddenly I had to figure it out. And because I was forced to figure it out, I somehow made it work. And after that, I learned so much and was able to take that skill set, and it affected a lot of different things that I work on. Like it even cross pollinates into my commercial work where, you know, certain things that people think are impossible, I'll figure out how to make it happen, you know, because a lot of people like to say no. And I think a lot of what I've learned, especially when I work with, because I work a lot with like high level talent, as you pointed out, is that you don't want to be a victim of other people's laziness, is what I advise people, which is like a truism of the world in some weird way, where like when you find yourself in certain projects or certain scenarios, you as a project inflates and you're working with like say 50 to 100 people and you're like, what can happen in those scenarios is that some people are not as invested as you are in something, you know? And so they're not going to put in the same passion you are. So you have to find a way constantly to be working either around that or motivating people to do that. You know what I mean? So that's like a whole crazy spectrum of things that I've been learning about throughout a lot of my career, but hasn't really become clear till recently, where I'm like starting to realize that don't you know, especially as a director, you don't want to be the victim of other people's laziness. Like you don't want, because you're at the mercy of how, you know, how someone else will sometimes work on something, you know. You want to find good collaborators, you know, you want to find people who find true passion in what they do. And you know, so it's a crazy thing, yeah. I don't know where I'm going with that, but that I feel like those are two hot gems right there that I gotta, because it's definitely this idea of like the idea of like if something seems like harder or more like really difficult, the minute you say yes and if it excites you, if it makes you passionate, you will find a way to figure it out and you will learn so much in doing that. And then as things get bigger, learning that, oh, not everyone else cares as much as you. So having to be like able to like maneuver around that and like find ways to like either, you know, find people who want to with you and like people who want to like work as hard as you do and like make as cool as you. Like you want to be surrounded by passionate people. Like I think that's what it is. And I think like I've done a good job at finding like cool, like I like to call them spiritual warriors, like people who are just like, yo, I'm super into this, I'm down with this, or this is cool. And I love being surrounded by people who find passion and aren't like generally being like, oh no, that's a problem. Like, no, it's not a problem. We should be figuring it out. Like, why aren't we being creative instead of just turning down something because it sounds crazy? And I feel like nothing cool has ever been made with people just saying, well, let's just settle. Like, that's not how you make cool at all, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's kind of like what I've learned, at least in those scenarios.
That's so cool. Now, our final question from another listener is from Taylor from New Zealand, and she asks, "Do you ever feel as though there's nothing original left to produce and create?"
I don't think that's the case because like I feel like I'm constantly in awe of like the I see people make. Like every so often some new pops off, and you're just like, what the hell? Like I didn't expect that. Like, even like say like Billie Eilish as an artist, for example, was kind of like an amazing surprise to me last year, where I was like, what? Somebody's like doing music on this level right now. This is cool.
Yeah,
Or the emergence of like dope films, where I'll be like I watched The Lighthouse recently, and it's a magnificent film, and I was like, wow, it's the just the fact that someone made that. Now, are these fans all necessarily original or just tapping into something larger? It's hard to say. I don't know. They're definitely. I mean, that's a big debate, right? Like, is there really ever an original thought? I mean,
yeah,
the truth is, we're all part of the canon of something larger. Like we all are kind of like this. You know, we humanity has been here for like a long time, right? And we
yeah,
are like kind of this generation. Every generation is like the collective sum of where we've gotten to culturally at that point, right? You know what I mean? And so
yeah,
we're we are empowered and have the canon of everything our predecessors did before us, and we can pull from it, and be able to talk and speak to that or use it, and create new things. Or um I guess this is what meme culture is kind of in a way, right? Where like, because meme culture, even though like we read it as like what it is now traditionally, is really about like pulling from things that we already have an association with, and then remixing it or recontextualizing. And so I think that a lot of what we do as artists, and when we put our own vision to it, is just kind of like our perspective on something. So
yeah,
we're entitled, we're able to kind of speak to these things that are larger than us, because in some weird way we also have ownership of it, because we are kind of like, we're that we're the new and we're able to kind of put a perspective on it. So, and I think that makes it new.
yeah. I think it's interesting too about kind of improving things and stuff. Like
Oh,
I'm
totally.
thinking, uh, Thomas Edison, made the light bulb. He didn't make a new and improved candle, but the thing is, the concept came from the idea of creating light with a candle, but he just improved it. And I think that's with us as creatives, we can always take something to the next level, even if it seems physically impossible, like there's nothing left to do. There's always going to be something more we can take it to another
Absolutely,
level.
100%. Yeah, it's like almost like before the candle, there was like a campfire, right? And it's like
Yeah, exactly.
from campfire to candle to light bulb. Then what's after that? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
that's definitely the way I think creative works. Where like you want to pull from other things, because that's a dialogue, and you want to be part of the dialogue and like expand it. So that's how I look at it creatively. Like I think there's always going to be something new, but it doesn't hurt to look at like the things that have been done before, because it's your perspective that's going to allow it to become new. So you have to really like infuse your perspective and what makes you unique, and that's going to make it
yeah,
stand out. And I think like that's the challenge, right? And I'm not going to say that finding your voice is easy. I think it takes a lot of. It's a
oh,
difficult
for sure.
process. It takes long time, but once you find it, and once you have that perspective, then it's yours, and it's yours alone. And the way you look at things will always be a little different, and you'll always be able to put a part of yourself into it. So I think that's how you make things original.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing on that. So as we come to a close, I was going to ask four quick fire questions. So answer these in a short sentence, if you can.
Yep.
So the first question is, what is your favorite movie?
Dog Day Afternoon by Sidney Lumet.
Great. Number two, what has been the highlight of your career so far?
Winning a jury award at South by Southwest.
And number 3, what is the most fulfilling part of your job?
Seeing how an audience reacts to your work.
Great. And finally, what is the single piece of advice you would give to a young creative?
So the best advice I would give young creatives is to take risk because especially as you're younger, you're going to be able to take those risks, in a way that as you get older might become more challenging. And it's definitely
Mm,
the time to be taking the risk. So don't be afraid to explore creatively. Don't be afraid especially now to like kind of just do something different and like see what happens, creatively because you might be defining something that everyone else wants to do eventually if you do it now.
yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Kris, for sharing with us today. I know we got so much value from it, and I think even though I'm not a filmmaker, well, I do a little bit, but not a director as such. As a graphic designer, as a musician, I've been able to take some of those concepts and apply it to what I do. And I think every other listener, whether you're an entrepreneur, an artist, a designer, musician, or writer, whatever you do, I think you can kind of learn from the stuff that you've just shared. So thank you so much, Kris.
Oh,
And it's been an honor to have you on.
thank you so much, man. I appreciate being part of this podcast. It is a big honor to just be here and like listen to me rant about crazy
And I think it's cool. Two weeks, 2 podcasts in a row, both named Kris. So I think I've got to find another Kris now.
I'll hook you up.
Kris Merc. There we
Yeah,
go.
I'll hook you up. I know a lot of Chris's.
There we go. Awesome. Thank you so much, Kris. And thanks for joining us today on the SayOk Creative Podcast. Make sure to share this with your friends and family on social media. And make sure to tune in next time with our next guest. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've learned a thing or two to help you on your creative journey. Once again, thanks to Kris Merc for joining us, and if you aren't already, go give him a follow on Instagram or Twitter. And if you found value in today's episode, please share it with your friends, colleagues and family, and make sure to join us next Tuesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or YouTube. This is the SayOk Creative Podcast.